The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in the spring of 1882, folded into thirds and sealed with plain red wax, and Joel Ellsworth read only as far as the words "plain and quiet" before he set it down on his kitchen table, stood up from his chair, and walked straight to the bedroom to pull his traveling bag from beneath the iron bed frame. He did not finish the page. He did not need to. Joel Ellsworth was 31 years old, broad-shouldered, and lean in the way that men who worked land for a living were lean, not by choice but by labor, by the kind of tiredness that settled into muscle and stayed there. He had bought 40 acres of good grazing land outside Abilene, Kansas, 3 years prior, and he had built the house himself, board by board, nail by nail, in the summer heat when the prairie grass turned gold, and the wind came off the flats like the breath of something enormous and indifferent. He had 3 horses, a dog named August who slept on the porch, and a kitchen that smelled of coffee and pine resin and the particular loneliness of a man who cooked for one every single night. The letter had come from a woman named Mrs. Hester Caulfield, who ran a correspondence service out of St. Louis, Missouri. Joel's older brother, Frank, had written to her on Joel's behalf, without Joel's knowledge, as it turned out, and Hester Caulfield had responded with a short list of available women who were seeking honest men in the territories and settled western states. Frank had read through the list and written back to narrow it down, and eventually Hester Caulfield had sent the full letter about one candidate in particular. The candidate's name was Lydia Hayes. Lydia Hayes was 24 years old. She lived in a small town called Millhaven in eastern Missouri, where she had been keeping house for her father since her mother passed away 4 years prior. She was, according to Mrs. Caulfield's letter, of modest appearance and gentle disposition, not given to excessive conversation or flights of fancy, but reliably steady in her habits and dutiful in her character. She had some schooling. She could cook. She was in good health. Her father was a farmer who was remarrying, and Lydia was, in Mrs. Caulfield's delicate phrasing, prepared to make a new arrangement. Plain and quiet. That was what stopped Joel mid-sentence. Because he had grown up in a house full of noise and color and women who were never described as plain in their lives. His mother had been a force of weather. His sister Clara had opinions about everything from cattle prices to the appropriate moment to plant winter rye, and she shared those opinions loudly and without invitation. Joel had loved all of it. He had loved the chaos of a home that was alive with personality. And here was Mrs. Caulfield writing to him about a woman who was plain and quiet, and something in Joel Ellsworth cracked open like dry earth after rain. Not because he wanted a woman who was small. Not because he wanted someone he could ignore or talk over or keep in the background of his life like furniture. No. Something far more specific moved through him when he read those words, something almost protective and wholly irrational, because he thought about what it meant to be described as plain and quiet by someone else, to be summarized in 2 dismissive words by a woman in St. Louis who had probably met Lydia Hayes once, if at all, and he thought about a woman who went through her days in a house that was not her own, cooking and cleaning for a father who was already busy falling in love with someone else. And he thought, nobody has told her she is remarkable. Nobody has taken the time. He packed his bag before he finished the page. He wrote a short note to Frank that said only, "You should have asked me first, but thank you, going to Missouri." He left August in Frank's care and rode the 40 miles to Abilene in the early morning, while the sky was still purple, and the coyotes were finishing their singing, and he bought a train ticket at the station with money he had been saving for a new fence line, and he sat in the passenger car with his hat on his knee and the unfinished letter in his breast pocket and watched Kansas roll past the window like a sentence that had not yet decided how to end. Millhaven, Missouri was smaller than Joel had expected, which was saying something, because he had not expected much. It was a town of perhaps 400 souls, pressed along a single main street that ran parallel to a shallow creek called Alder Run. There was a general store, a church, a livery, a post office that was also the telegraph office, a saloon that looked as though it had been built in a hurry and never quite finished, and a scattering of homes and outbuildings along the roads that spread from the main street like fingers. Joel arrived on a Thursday afternoon in late April, when the dogwood trees were still blooming in white clusters, and the air smelled of creek water and turned earth. He stepped off the mail coach that had carried him the last 12 miles from the nearest rail stop, and stood in the middle of Millhaven's Main Street with his bag over one shoulder, squinting in the afternoon light. He found a room at the boarding house run by a Mrs. Prewitt, who was a small, efficient woman with sharp eyes, and an immediate and transparent curiosity about what brought a well-built Kansas rancher to Millhaven in the middle of spring planting season. Business, Joel told her, which was not entirely a lie. Of what sort, she asked. He thought about it. Personal, he said, and she nodded as though this explained everything and nothing simultaneously, and showed him to his room. That evening he sat on the narrow bed in Mrs. Prewitt's boarding house and finally read the rest of the letter. It did not tell him much more than he already knew. Lydia Hayes's father was named Thomas Hayes, and he farmed 30 acres east of town. The wedding between Thomas and his new bride, a widow named Pauline Grange, was scheduled for the second week of May. After that, there would no longer be a natural role for Lydia in that household, and the question of what came next was pressing. Mrs. Caulfield had written, "Miss Hayes is aware that her situation has been presented to several gentlemen of good standing in the Western Territories. She is agreeable to correspondence, and if a meeting should be arranged, I am confident she would present herself well." Agreeable to correspondence. Joel folded the letter and put it in the drawer of the nightstand. He had not come to correspond. He was already here. He would simply have to figure out how to introduce himself to a woman who had no idea he was coming, in a town that was not his own, without appearing either desperate or strange. He decided to start at the general store. The next morning, Friday, Joel walked the length of Millhaven's Main Street in the clear early light and pushed open the door of Harmon's general store. It was a well-stocked place for a town that size, with barrels of flour and salt along one wall, bolts of fabric and thread along another, and a long wooden counter behind which a young man of about 20 was arranging tins of coffee with great concentration. "Morning," Joel said. "Morning," said the young man without looking up. Joel browsed without urgency, picking up a tin of tobacco he did not need, and a pair of leather gloves that were better than his own. He was examining the gloves when the front door opened again, and a woman came in carrying a basket over her arm. He glanced at her. She was not what he had been picturing, which he realized immediately was because he had been picturing nothing specific, just a vague sketch of someone forgettable, and that was already wrong. The woman who came through the door of Harmon's general store was of medium height, with dark brown hair pulled back neatly beneath a bonnet she wore without tying the ribbons, and she moved with the particular efficiency of someone who had learned to complete tasks in an organized manner, because there was always another task waiting. She was wearing a plain blue dress and a shawl in a darker shade, and her face, when she turned toward the counter, was, well, Joel thought Mrs. Caulfield had lied. She had a good face. Not the kind that stopped a room, not the kind that poets quarreled over, but the kind that you would look at and feel inexplicably as though you were standing somewhere safe. Wide-set dark eyes with something watchful in them. A straight nose. A mouth that was serious in its natural resting expression, which gave it tremendous potential for warmth when it changed. She was not plain. She was contained, which was entirely different. "Good morning, Miss Hayes," said the young man behind the counter, and Joel went very still. "Good morning, William," she said. Her voice was even and clear and low for a woman's. She set her basket on the counter and pulled a folded paper from her apron pocket. "Father's list, if you don't mind. No rush today." "I'll have it pulled together by noon," William said. "Thank you." She turned slightly to glance around the store, and her eyes moved across Joel the way a person's eyes move across a piece of furniture, noting presence, not particularity. And then she turned back to William and said something quiet about whether the next fabric shipment had come in yet. Joel stood there holding the leather gloves and felt, for the first time in a long while, entirely uncertain of himself. He bought the gloves and the tobacco and left. He spent the rest of the morning walking the perimeter of Millhaven and constructing and discarding approximately 11 different approaches to introducing himself. Every version sounded either presumptuous or pitiful. He could not walk up to a woman he had never spoken to and say, "I read a letter about you that said you were plain and quiet, and I thought that was so wrong that I got on a train." He could not say, "My brother submitted me to a mail-order correspondence service, and your name came up, and I find myself in your town with no specific plan." He could not say nothing, either, because he had not come all this way to stand in a general store looking at her from across a room like a man watching something beautiful through glass. In the end, the introduction arranged itself, the way things sometimes do when a person stops trying to engineer them. Saturday afternoon, Joel was sitting on the bench outside Mrs. Pruitt's boarding house reading a 3-day-old newspaper when he heard a horse in distress. Not injured, but agitated, the specific high-strung complaint of an animal that had gotten spooked and was pulling against its tether. He looked up and saw a brown mare tied to the hitching post outside the post office, dancing sideways and straining, and beside the post office door, Lydia Hayes was holding the door open with one hip while trying to manage both her basket and a stack of envelopes, and clearly the mare was hers, and clearly the arrival of a dog from across the street had set the animal off. Joel was already moving before he had decided to move. He crossed the street in a few long strides and took hold of the mare's bridle, speaking low and steady in the way that worked on most horses, which was less about the words and more about the frequency of the voice, calm and present and unafraid. The mare blew hard through her nose but stopped dancing, and after another moment she dropped her head. "There," Joel said, mostly to the horse. "Thank you," said Lydia Hayes from about 4 feet away. He turned and looked at her. Up close she was more specific. There was a small scar at the edge of her left eyebrow that told a story he did not know yet. Her eyes were very dark, nearly black in the bright afternoon light, and they were sharp eyes, the kind that noticed things and filed them. "She spooked at the dog," Joel said. "She spooks at everything," Lydia said, with a resignation that was not quite irritation. "She is my father's horse and she has the nerves of a canary. I keep telling him she is not suited for town trips, but he sends me on them anyway." "She just needs to know you're there," Joel said. He stroked the mare's neck once and then stepped back. "Put your hand on her neck before you step up. Steady pressure." Lydia looked at him with those filing eyes. "Are you passing through?" she asked, which was the natural question in a town where everyone knew everyone. "I am," he said, and then, because it was already almost a lie and he had not intended to lie, he added, "I was, possibly. I'm considering some land in the area." This was not true, but he could not explain himself yet, not standing in the middle of a street with a mare between them and the whole town potentially watching from behind curtains. He needed more time. He needed to not frighten her off in the first 30 seconds. "There's good land east of town," she said, without any particular investment in whether he took it or not. "Along Alder Run." "I'll look into it," he said. She gathered herself and her basket and her envelopes in the collected way she had, and she untied the mare with one hand while the other rested against the animal's neck, steady pressure, and the mare held still. She glanced at him once more before she mounted, and he could not read the glance except that it was not unfriendly. "Thank you for your help," she said. "Joel Ellsworth," he said. "From Abilene." A small pause. "Lydia Hayes," she said, "because that was what you said when someone told you their name." She rode east out of town, and he stood in the street watching the road after she had gone and thought, well, it was a start. He stayed in Millhaven. He told Mrs. Pruitt he would need the room for at least another week, and Mrs. Pruitt accepted this news with the polite discretion of someone who was internally noting everything for later discussion at her ladies' sewing circle. Joel did not much mind. He had found, over the course of his 31 years, that other people's interest in his affairs was generally harmless, and that the best response to gossip was to give it nothing dramatic to work with. Over the next several days, he settled into the rhythms of Millhaven with the patience that years of ranching had given him. He helped the livery owner, a heavy-set man named Conrad Bauer, reset a fence that had been pushed out by a stubborn mule. He drank coffee at the general store and talked cattle prices with William, who turned out to be not 20 but 23, and had opinions on the beef market that were mostly wrong but delivered with confidence. He attended the Sunday service at the white-painted church on the hill, which was the kind of church that was too warm in summer and too cold in winter, and the congregation loved it anyway. Lydia Hayes was at the Sunday service. She sat with her father, Thomas Hayes, who was a weathered man of about 55 with the look of someone who had spent too many decades in Missouri sun and not enough decades eating properly. Beside Thomas sat Pauline Grange, the widow he was to marry, who was a round-faced woman with silver-streaked hair and an expression of settled happiness that suggested she had waited a long time for this and intended to enjoy it thoroughly. Lydia sat on her father's other side and sang the hymns from memory, which meant she did not look at the hymnal, which meant she was looking forward, calm, composed, present. Joel sat 3 rows back and found it difficult to pay adequate attention to the sermon. After the service, there was the customary milling about in front of the church, while the reverend shook hands and children ran between adult legs and neighbors caught up on the week's worth of news and small grievance. Joel maneuvered himself, with what he hoped was casual naturalness, into the general vicinity of the Hayes family. Thomas Hayes shook his hand with the grip of a man who sized other men up by their handshakes and seemed provisionally satisfied. Pauline Grange smiled at him with the warmth of a woman who liked adding new people to her sense of community. Lydia Hayes stood beside them and let her eyes travel from his face to his boots and back again with the same thoughtful assessment she had given him at the post office. "You're the man from Abilene," Thomas Hayes said. "Conrad Bauer mentioned you." "I helped with his fence line," Joel said. "Good man." "He is," Thomas agreed. "You're looking at land east of town, I hear." Joel accepted this version of events. "Looking," he confirmed. "My land runs along Alder Run," Thomas said. "Good soil, good water. If you wanted to have a look, you're welcome to ride out." This was not what Joel had planned exactly, but he recognized the gift of it. "I'd appreciate that," he said. Thomas Hayes named a morning that week, and Joel agreed, and across the small social space between them, Lydia Hayes was looking at a point somewhere past Joel's left shoulder with an expression he could not immediately catalog. Not suspicious, not pleased, something more thoughtful than either. He rode out to the Hayes farm on Tuesday morning with the creeks running clear and the air full of birdsong and the kind of spring light that made Missouri look like a painting. Thomas Hayes showed him the land along Alder Run, which was in fact good land, better than Joel had let on that he knew, because he had been a farmer long enough to read soil and drainage the way other men read print. They talked crops and seasons and the vagaries of Missouri weather versus Kansas weather, and Thomas Hayes was neither a fool nor an easy man, and Joel found himself genuinely interested in the conversation in a way that had nothing to do with the reason he had come. Lydia appeared at noon with a basket. She came across the field from the farmhouse with the basket over her arm and a shawl against the remaining spring chill, and she walked with the same efficient directness she had in town, no particular self-consciousness, no performance. She set the basket on a flat stone near the creek bank and unpacked it. Bread, cold chicken, boiled eggs, a small crock of butter, a jar of blackberry preserves. "You'll stay for the noon meal," Thomas told Joel, which was not quite a question. "Thank you," Joel said. They ate by the creek in the spring light, the 3 of them, with the water running shallow and clear over smooth stones and a red-tailed hawk turning slow circles in the high blue above. Thomas Hayes ate with the concentration of a man who had worked hard that morning, and between bites, he asked Joel more questions about Abilene and the cattle business, and what a man could expect from Kansas land compared to Missouri. Joel answered honestly, which was his nature, and did not oversell anything. Lydia was quiet, not the silence of someone with nothing to say. He was already learning the difference. She listened with an attentiveness that was almost physical. She turned slightly toward whoever was speaking, and her eyes moved to connect what was being said with what she was already thinking, and occasionally something would cross her face that was a thought she had decided not to speak aloud. He found he wanted to know what those thoughts were. When Thomas got up to walk back toward the barn to check on something, leaving them momentarily at the creek bank, Joel turned to Lydia and said, "You know this land very well." She looked at him with a kind of mild surprise, as though she had not expected to be addressed directly. "I grew up here," she said. "Do you like it, this part of Missouri?" She considered this as a serious question which he appreciated. "I like the creek in spring," she said after a moment. "And the light in October when the leaves turn. The summers are too hot and the winters are usually too wet. But yes, I suppose I like it well enough. You've never wanted to go somewhere else." She turned her dark eyes on him with a steadiness that he was beginning to find remarkable. "People want all kinds of things," she said. "Wanting and getting are different. I'm practical about the difference." "That's not the same as saying you don't want things," he said. A pause. The creek ran between its stones. Somewhere in the willows a meadowlark sang. "No," she said quietly. "It's not the same." Thomas came back from the barn, and the moment folded up and passed, the way moments do. But Joel walked back into Millhaven that afternoon with the particular sensation of someone who has found the first loose thread of a tapestry and is wondering what will happen if he pulls it. He went to see Reverend Aldous Kemp the next morning. Reverend Kemp was a thin, dry man in his 60s who had preached in Millhaven for 20 years and knew everything about everyone, which was both the blessing and the occupational hazard of his position. He received Joel in the small study behind the church with the measured interest of someone who had learned not to be surprised by anything. "I need your guidance on something," Joel said. "That's what I'm here for," Kemp said. Joel put it as plainly as he knew how. He had come to Millhaven because of a correspondence service. He had been corresponding. Or rather, his brother had been corresponding about a possible match with Lydia Hayes, and he had arrived in person because something in the letter had compelled him, and he had not wanted to wait for letters to go back and forth across the country when he could simply come and see for himself. But he had not yet explained any of this to Lydia Hayes or to her father, and he was not certain how to do so without it seeming either calculating or ridiculous. Kemp listened without interrupting. When Joel finished, the Reverend was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Does she know her situation was presented to the service?" "The letter suggested she was aware," Joel said, "that her name was offered and she was agreeable to correspondence." "Agreeable to correspondence," Kemp said, with a faint emphasis that suggested he understood the difference between that and agreeable to a stranger arriving in her town unannounced. "I know," Joel said. "Thomas Hayes is a good man," Kemp said. "He loves his daughter. He wants her settled before he remarries, and I believe his intentions are kind, even if the method is somewhat impersonal." Kemp folded his hands. "Miss Hayes is a thoughtful young woman. She is not easily impressed, and she is not given to melodrama, but she is not indifferent either. She has feelings she doesn't often display." He paused. "She deserves honesty." "I know that too," Joel said. "Then I would suggest you tell her," Kemp said. "Not through her father directly, and soon." Joel walked out of the church into the bright May morning and stood for a moment in the churchyard among the old tombstones while a soft wind moved through the new grass, and he decided that Reverend Kemp was right, as reverends generally were about things like this. He went that afternoon to the Hayes farm. Lydia was in the kitchen garden behind the house, on her knees in the turned earth, planting something. He could see the row markers, the careful spacing. He came around the side of the house, and she looked up at the sound of his footsteps, and her expression shifted through surprise and something more guarded before settling into its usual watchful composure. "Mr. Ellsworth," she said. "Miss Hayes." He stopped a few feet from the garden edge. "I need to speak with you honestly if you'll allow it." She sat back on her heels and gave him the full weight of those dark eyes. "All right," she said. He told her. He told her about the correspondence service, about Frank's letter, about Mrs. Caulfield's description. He told her about reading plain and quiet and packing his bag before he finished the page. He told her he had not come to inspect her or to make any kind of demand. He had come because something in the letter had made him feel that whoever Lydia Hayes was, she was not being accurately described, and he had wanted to find out for himself. And that was, he understood, an unusual and possibly unwelcome thing to do. He stopped speaking. Lydia Hayes was looking at him with an expression he could not read at all. The silence stretched out between them, and the kitchen garden smelled of turned earth and early herbs, and somewhere in the farmyard a rooster had something to say. "Plain and quiet," she said finally. "Yes." Those were her words. "Yes." Another pause. "And you packed your bags." "Before I finished the page," he said. Something moved through her face, not a smile, not yet, but the precursor to one, the interior shifting that happens before the surface changes. "Why?" she said. He thought about how to say it. "Because those weren't the words of someone who knew you," he said. "They were the words of someone who looked at you and decided quickly. And I thought, whoever this woman is, someone should take more time." The silence that followed was a different kind than before, softer. "I am quiet," she said. "That part wasn't wrong." "Quiet and plain aren't the same thing," he said. She looked down at her hands, still darkened with garden earth, and he could see her thinking, processing, assessing, deciding what was true and what she was willing to say about it. "You came a long way," she said. "I did. You could have written first." "I know." She looked up at him. "You're not quite what I expected either," she said. "What did you expect?" he asked. "Someone who read a letter about a woman in a difficult situation and thought that sounded convenient," she said, with a directness that was not unkind but was entirely honest. "Men who use correspondence services aren't always looking for a person. Sometimes they're looking for a solution." "I understand that," he said. "I'm not here for a solution. I'm here because I read about a person and thought she deserved better than 2 words." She held his gaze for a long moment with those sharp, private eyes, and then she said, "I'll think about it." That was not a refusal. He recognized it as such and took it for what it was. He went back to Mrs. Prewitt's and that night wrote a long letter to Frank that was partly gratitude and partly a complaint about the entire situation, and ended with the line, "She said she'd think about it, which means she has not thrown me out, which I am counting as a success." Frank wrote back within the week, "For the love of God, be patient, Joel." He was patient. He stayed in Millhaven through the first week of May, helping Conrad Bauer with additional work at the livery, and helping Thomas Hayes with some fencing along the east field, and eating supper twice more at the Hayes farmhouse, because Thomas Hayes had invited him, and because Lydia had not uninvited him, which he was also counting. Those suppers were the most important hours of those weeks. Around the Hayes table, with Thomas talking about the season's planting and Pauline Grange stopping by on the second occasion to help with the cooking, the evening light coming golden through the kitchen windows, Joel began to know Lydia Hayes in the way that you know someone when the formality of newness wears thin and the actual person begins to show through. She was not loud, but she was never empty. When she spoke, it was worth listening to. She had read more widely than he had expected. She mentioned Scott and Dickens, and a history of the Oregon Territory with the ease of someone who had spent winters reading by a lamp, which was exactly what she had done. She had opinions about weather and farming and what the county needed and did not need, and she expressed them in the quiet, certain way of a person who has thought something through and no longer needs volume to defend it. She was funny, in a way that surprised him. Not broad comedy, not performance, a dry, unexpected wit that arrived in single sentences and made him laugh before he knew he was going to. One evening at supper, Thomas was going on about a neighboring farmer named Caldwell who had tried to run a scheme involving mislabeled seed grain, and Lydia said, without looking up from her plate, "Caldwell is going to be the last man in Missouri to figure out that everyone already knows he's Caldwell." And Thomas laughed until he coughed, and Joel laughed too, And across the table, Lydia caught his eye for just a moment with a look that said, "Yes, I know that was funny." That look was worth the train ticket. He asked her to walk with him one Sunday after the service, and she said yes. They walked along the main street of Millhaven in the warm afternoon light, not quite touching, a respectable distance because this was 1882 and Millhaven was a small town with observant inhabitants. But they talked, without the buffer of her father or the structure of a meal, just the two of them moving through the spring afternoon. He told her about his land outside Abilene, about the house he had built himself, the 40 acres, the 3 horses, the dog August. He told her about his parents, both gone now, his father from a fever in the winter of 1874, his mother from a heart that simply gave out 2 years later, which Joel had always suspected was more grief than medicine. He told her about Frank and Clara and the 2 other siblings scattered across the country, and the way holidays felt both full and hollow when you were the only one in a house with a big kitchen. She told him about her mother, Margaret Hayes, dead 4 years from pneumonia, who had been a school teacher before she married Thomas and who had filled their farmhouse with books and arguments and strong opinions about the education of girls. She told him about learning to cook and manage a house at 20, the year her mother died, taking on the keeping of everything, the work, the worry, her father's grief, all of it. She told him this without complaint, just as fact, which made it more affecting than any complaint could have been. "You've been holding a lot," he said. "Everyone holds something," she said. "Some people get to put it down sometimes," he said. She looked at the road ahead of them, at the light coming through the new leaves of the elm trees along the street. "I suppose I've been waiting for someone to offer to carry some of it," she said, and her voice was very quiet. "I just didn't expect it to come from a man I'd never heard of who read a letter and packed a bag. Life is strange," he said. "It is," she agreed. They walked back toward the boarding house in the sweet May afternoon, and at the corner where she would turn toward the livery to collect her father's mare, she stopped and faced him and said, "I'm glad you came, Joel Ellsworth, for what it's worth." He found that it was worth quite a lot. The wedding of Thomas Hayes and Pauline Grange took place on the 14th of May, a Saturday, in the white church on the hill. Millhaven turned out for it, the way small towns turn out for any occasion that gives them an excuse to dress well and eat cake, and stand in the good light of a spring afternoon talking to their neighbors. Thomas was nervous in a way that was endearing in a man of 55. And Pauline was radiant in the unhurried way of a woman who has been happy for some time and is simply now making it official. Lydia stood at her father's side as a witness, in a dress of deep blue that was the most color Joel had seen her wear, with her hair arranged more carefully than usual, and she held herself with the composed dignity that was her nature. And she smiled at her father during the vows with a warmth that Joel had to look away from because it did something unexpected to him. After the ceremony, during the celebration at the church hall, Joel found himself beside her near the table of food, both of them holding plates and watching Thomas and Pauline accept congratulations from a stream of neighbors. "He's happy," Joel said. "He is," Lydia said. "He deserves to be. He was lonely for a long time." "And you," he said. "Are you happy for him?" She thought about it, which was her way with any question worth answering. "Yes," she said, genuinely. "Pauline is a good woman and she'll take care of him. It's just," she paused, "it's the end of one arrangement and the beginning of needing to think about what comes next. That's all." "I'd like to be part of what comes next," he said, "if you'd consider it." She turned her face to look at him directly, and there was nothing guarded in it now, none of the careful filing and assessment. Just the real thing beneath, thoughtful and warm and slightly afraid, the way people are when something they want is within reach and the wanting of it makes them vulnerable. "Ask me properly," she said. "I will," he said. "But not here and not today. Today is your father's day. I'll ask you properly when there's time to do it right." She nodded, and the corner of her mouth curved, and she looked back at her father dancing awkwardly with Pauline to the fiddle music someone had started up in the corner, and she was happy. Joel could see it, all the layers of it, both the gift and the difficulty of it, and he thought that she was one of the most honest people he had ever sat beside, and that the next part of his life was going to be far better than the part before. He asked her on a Wednesday, 3 days after the wedding. Thomas and Pauline had left for a brief wedding trip to Jefferson City, which meant the farm was Lydia's to manage alone for a week, and Joel had been helping with the morning chores before going about his own business in town. It had become a natural arrangement without anyone officially arranging it. That Wednesday morning he found her at the fence of the kitchen garden with a piece of fencing that had gone loose during the recent rain, and without discussion, he took the tools from her hands and fixed it while she held the post steady, and afterward, when the fence was right and the tools were put away, and the morning light lay warm and uncomplicated across the farmyard, he turned to her and said, "Lydia, I know I'm still something of a stranger, and I know this is a strange way to have come to know someone, and I know you've had decisions made about your life by other people without your full say in it, and I don't want to be another one of those. So I'm asking you plainly because I think that's what you prefer. Will you come to Kansas with me as my wife, and let me spend however many years I have trying to be worthy of you?" She was looking at him with those dark, serious eyes, and her hands were still a little dusty from the garden fence, and somewhere behind her the rooster was going on again, and the morning was entirely ordinary and entirely perfect. "Yes," she said, "I will." He took her hands, dusty and all, and held them, and she let him, and for a moment neither of them said anything because it seemed like the right time to let the morning speak for itself. They were married in Millhaven's White Church on the 31st of May, 1882, with Reverend Aldous Kemp presiding and Thomas Hayes, returned from Jefferson City and looking younger than he had in years, giving Lydia away with the careful solemnity of a man who is both happy and aware of the weight of the moment. Frank Ellsworth had come from Abilene for the wedding, and he sat in the second row with his wife, a tall, cheerful woman named Nora, and cried throughout the ceremony with the shamelessness of someone who had arranged the whole thing and felt entitled to the emotional reward of it. Pauline Grange, now Pauline Hayes, sat beside Frank and Nora and handed Frank her handkerchief without comment because she was a practical woman. Lydia wore her mother's wedding dress, let out at the waist and taken in at the shoulders, ivory and simple, and when Joel turned and saw her coming down the aisle on her father's arm, his chest did something large and unmanageable, and he was briefly grateful that no one could see inside him. She reached him. She looked up at him with those direct, real eyes, and there was something in them that had not been there in the kitchen garden or at the creek or across the table. Something opened fully, the way a window opens in the morning to let the whole day in. "Ready?" she said very quietly because she was always practical. "I've been ready since Tuesday morning in Kansas," he said. She almost smiled. "Let's not keep the Reverend waiting," she said. They were married. The journey from Millhaven to Abilene took 3 days by rail and stage, and in those 3 days Joel and Lydia Ellsworth began the particular and irreplaceable process of learning how to be with each other in the close, unglamorous reality of shared space. They discovered that Lydia had very definite opinions about the arrangement of traveling luggage, and Joel had very definite opinions about train schedules, and these opinions occasionally collided with the good-natured friction of two people who are both organized and are reorganizing around each other. They also discovered that they could sit in compatible silence for long stretches, which Joel considered one of the most important discoveries a person could make about another person. Lydia looked out the window as Kansas began to appear, the flats, the enormous sky, the grass stretching away to the horizon in every direction, and her expression was so interior, so full of something she was processing privately, that Joel did not interrupt it. He just watched the same land she was watching and let her have the moment of arriving somewhere new. "It's very large," she said eventually. "It is," he agreed. "Missouri has hills," she said. "Kansas has sky," he said. She considered this. "I think I can manage sky," she said. August the dog was waiting at Frank's place, and when Joel walked up to the porch, the old dog launched himself off the boards with all the grace of a falling grain sack and landed against Joel's legs, and then turned immediately to investigate Lydia with his entire face. She stood still and let him smell her hands, and then she scratched behind his ears with the practiced ease of someone who had been around animals all her life, and August sat down heavily on her feet, which was the highest compliment in his repertoire. "He likes you," Joel said. "He likes that I smell like farm," she said. "Either way," Joel said. "The house." He had been a little worried about the house, which was a man's house in the specific way that men who live alone inevitably build a house that is functional and nothing more. It was solid, he had built it well, it would outlast him, but it had no softness to it, no color, nothing that said this is a home rather than a shelter. Lydia walked through every room without speaking, the way a doctor examines a patient thorough, without premature conclusion. She looked at the kitchen and the sleeping room, and the two rooms that were not yet anything, and the back porch that faced south toward the flat horizon. Then she came back to the kitchen, sat down at the table and said, "I would like to put a window in the back room." "All right," he said, "and the kitchen needs more light. I can add a window, and I'd like a kitchen garden by spring. The soil looks right for it." "It is," he said, "good drainage along the south side." She looked around the kitchen with something that was already in its early way proprietary. This was her space now. She was taking the measure of it, thinking about what it could become. "It's a good house," she said. "You built it well." "I built it for someone," he said. "I just didn't know who yet." She looked at him with those dark, direct eyes, and there it was again, that opening. "I'm glad it was me," she said. The first months of that summer were the education. Not difficult, not painful, just the sustained and necessary work of building a shared life from the materials of two separate ones. They discovered where they fit and where they didn't, and the places they didn't fit they negotiated with the seriousness and goodwill of people who are both fundamentally decent and genuinely want to be in the same house. Lydia took to the ranch work with the thoroughness that was her character. She was not a woman who needed to be told things twice, and she was not a woman who pretended she knew something she didn't. She asked direct questions and then did not ask them again. She learned the horses' names and personalities within the first week. There was Copper, who was easy, Garrison, who was cautious, and Belle, a young mare with opinions about everything, whom Lydia and Joel both agreed was a trial and was also their favorite. She started the kitchen garden in the cleared patch along the south side of the house, working the soil herself in the mornings before the heat built. Joel helped when he could, and even when the garden was entirely hers, he would come and sit on the back porch and drink coffee and watch her work, and she would talk, not a torrent of words, but steadily, the thoughts she was having while her hands were busy, observations about the soil and what she was planting and what she was reading, and what she thought about the new pastor who had taken over in Abilene since the old one retired. He loved to hear her think out loud. He loved that she trusted him with the interior of her mind. She read in the evenings with a focused pleasure that made him feel the house had come alive. She had brought her books from Millhaven, 4 crates of them, which he had not expected and which delighted him, and they stacked on the shelves he built for her in the back room, and she moved through them with the systematic joy of someone who has spent years loving something privately and can now share it without apology. He was not as much of a reader as she was, but she read to him sometimes in the evenings, sitting across from him near the lamp with the big Kansas dark pressing against the windows, her voice low and clear and steady, and he would sit with his hands around a cup of cooling coffee and listen, and it was, well, it was everything he had imagined a home could be, when he had been imagining it in the big, empty silence of a kitchen built for two. There were hard things, too. The summer was punishing that year. A drought came in July that cracked the earth and cost him 2 sections of hay and strained the water situation at the stock tank. He worked brutal hours in the heat, and Lydia worked beside him without being asked, hauling water and managing the stock, and helping where help was needed with the practical intelligence of a woman who understood that a farm was a living thing that demanded everything from everyone when it was in trouble. One evening in early August, at the end of a day so hot the air shimmered above the flat land, they sat on the back porch in the dark and were too tired to talk, and Lydia leaned her head against his shoulder and said nothing, and he put his arm around her and said nothing either, and August lay at their feet panting at the hot stars, and the night was large and still around them. "I didn't expect it to be easy," she said, eventually. "It gets better in fall," he said. "I know," she said. "I'm not complaining, I'm just saying," a pause. "I feel useful here, that's not nothing." "You're not just useful," he said. "You're the whole," he stopped, because he was not always quick with words and he did not want to say it wrong. "You're the whole point of it," he said. "The ranch is just what keeps us. You're what makes it worth keeping." She lifted her head and looked at him in the dark and the moonlight that was beginning to come across the prairie, and then she kissed him with the entirety of what she was, quiet and real and thoroughly itself. And that was, he thought, as close to perfect as anything he had ever experienced. Autumn came to the Kansas plains in the slow, golden, enormous way that autumn came to wide country, not arriving suddenly, but beginning from everywhere at once, the light changing angle and weight, the grass going tawny, the sky deepening from summer's washed blue to something darker and more serious. Lydia was right that she could manage sky. She had a particular relationship with the late afternoon light of October on the prairie that she could not quite explain, except that it felt like something she had not known she was missing from her Missouri hills. She wrote to her father regularly, and Thomas Hayes wrote back in his careful farmer's hand, and Pauline added postscripts that grew longer and warmer as the months passed. Lydia read these letters at the kitchen table in the mornings with her coffee, and Joel watched the way she smiled at her father's descriptions of his new life, the pride and the love and the new ease in it, and he thought how strange and complete a thing it was that a letter he had read in April had led them both here, to this kitchen, to this life. He told her so one morning. She looked at him over the letter and her dark eyes were warm. "Mrs. Caulfield should know the effect of her correspondence," she said. "Frank should know," Joel said. "He started it. Frank is going to be insufferable about it forever," she said. "He already is," Joel said. "Let him," she said. "He did well." Frank and Nora visited in October, making the trip from their place outside Lawrence, and Nora and Lydia took to each other immediately in the way of two women who are both sharp and practical and find each other refreshing after too much time around people who are neither. They spent 2 evenings at the kitchen table talking, while Frank and Joel sat on the porch trading opinions about everything from cattle prices to territorial politics, and the lamplight came gold through the kitchen window, and the prairie dark spread out around them, and it was exactly the kind of evening that felt, even in the middle of it, like something you would remember. Nora said to Lydia on the second evening with the directness that Joel had apparently married into as a family trait, "He's different, you know, since you came." Lydia set down her cup. "Different how?" "Less waiting," Nora said. "He used to have the look of a man who is always looking for something he can't see yet, like he was standing in the right field but turned the wrong direction. Now he's here, turned the right way." She smiled. "You did that." Lydia was quiet for a moment. "He did that," she said. "He packed a bag before he finished reading." Nora laughed. "Frank told me he's very proud of that story." "He should be," Lydia said. "It was either the most romantic thing I've ever heard or the most reckless." "Why not both?" Nora said. "Why not both?" Lydia agreed. In November, Lydia told Joel she was expecting. She told him in the kitchen, on a gray morning with the first real cold pressing against the windows. In the same direct, quiet way, she told him everything important, looking at him steadily, giving him the information without inflation or dramatics, and then watching his face for what came next. What came next was that Joel Ellsworth sat down in the kitchen chair because his legs made that decision before his mind did, and he sat there for a moment with his hands on his knees, and then he looked up at her and said, "Are you well?" "I'm well," she said. Are you happy about it?" She considered him for a moment, and then the warmth came into her face the full way, the held-back nothing remaining. "I am very happy about it," she said. He stood up and crossed the kitchen and held her with the careful, intent feeling of someone holding something that is both very strong and very precious, and she held him back the same way, and the cold November morning pressed against the windows and did not matter. They wrote to Thomas Hayes and Pauline, and Thomas wrote back in a letter that was mostly illegible with emotion. They wrote to Frank and Nora, and Frank wrote back with so many exclamation points that it was almost embarrassing. Clara, Joel's sister, wrote from her place in Colorado with the practical warmth of a woman who had already raised 3 children and had a great deal of useful information to share immediately. The winter was the best of Joel's life, and he knew it in the middle of it, which was rare. The cold came hard in January, and the prairie turned white and the wind found every gap in the house's construction, and he spent several days tracking down drafts and filling them. Lydia made the house warm from the inside, not just with the stove, though she was formidable with the stove, but with the general fact of her presence, the books and the coffee and the long quiet evenings, and the particular contentment of a woman who has found where she belongs and is busy becoming more herself inside it. She was reading one February evening, sitting across from him with her feet tucked up and the lamp closed and a blanket across her lap, and he was looking at her more than at anything else in the room, and she felt it and looked up. "What?" she said. "I was thinking about the letter," he said. She closed her book on her finger to hold the place. "Plain and quiet," she said. "I want to write back to Mrs. Caulfield," he said. "I want to tell her she used the wrong words." Lydia looked at him with the expression he loved best, the one that was almost a smile but was also entirely serious about something underneath. "What words would you use?" she said. He thought about it with genuine care because it mattered. "Necessary," he said. "I would say she is necessary, that she is the kind of person a place becomes more itself around. That she is quiet the way a deep river is quiet, not because there's nothing there, but because there is so much that it moves without noise." Lydia looked at him for a long moment. Something moved through her face that she did not try to conceal. "Joel," she said, "yes, that is the most anyone has ever said to me." "I know," he said, "and I plan to spend the rest of my life making that less remarkable." She put her book down and crossed the room to sit beside him on the bench by the window, and the winter dark was enormous around the house, and the lamp was steady and close, and she rested her head against his shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and the prairie night was everything it always was, wide and cold and ancient and full of stars. They could not see through the clouds, and inside the house that he had built for someone and she had made into a home. They sat together in the particular silence of 2 people who have found each other and are no longer waiting for anything. Their son was born in July of 1883, on a clear hot night when the crickets were deafening, and the stars were out in uncountable numbers over the Kansas flat. Joel was there for all of it, because he had not entertained any other possibility, and Clara had come from Colorado to help, and Clara was remarkable in a crisis, calm and competent, and inclined toward useful action over panic. They named him Thomas William Ellsworth, for Lydia's father and Joel's father both, and he was not small and he was not quiet, and from approximately the first hour of his life he had opinions, which Lydia regarded with the expression of someone who recognizes a familiar trait arriving from an unexpected direction. "He has your volume," she said to Joel on the second morning. "He has your determination," Joel said. "He has my exhaustion," she said, which was true, and Joel took the baby so she could sleep and sat on the back porch in the summer morning with his son against his chest, and Thomas William Ellsworth, who had not been in the world for 48 hours yet, looked up at his father with the unfocused but profound attention of newborns, and Joel looked back at him, and out over the prairie the morning light spread its gold across everything. And August the dog sat at Joel's feet, and was very quiet and very respectful about the whole situation. Thomas Hayes came from Millhaven in August, with Pauline, and he held his grandson with the particular careful reverence of a man who understands that he is holding the future. He cried. He had apparently cried quite a lot in the past year, since his remarriage, and Pauline had developed the same patient handkerchief habit she had observed at the wedding. Lydia watched her father with her son in his arms, and her face was full of everything. The love and the grief of her mother not being here for this, and the joy of her father being here, and the specific gratitude of someone who knows that the path to this moment was not straight and was not certain, and is all the more remarkable for it. Joel stood beside her on the back porch, and she put her hand in his and he held it, and the August afternoon lay warm and full on the prairie around them, and their life was not simple and was not finished, and was, from any angle he could find to look at it, exactly what it was meant to be. The years moved the way years do on working land measured by seasons and crops, and the particular challenges each year presents, as though weather and circumstance are determined to keep a person from becoming complacent. The drought of 1882 was followed by a wet spring in 1883 and a good harvest, and 1884 brought hail in May that took out the early planting and required redoing, and 1885 was the best year they had had on the 40 acres, the hay coming in thick and the cattle prices up, and Joel put the profit into buying another 15 acres along the north side that he had had his eye on for 2 years. Through all of it, the ranch grew because they worked it together, not because Joel worked and Lydia managed the house, though she did manage the house with extraordinary competence, but because Lydia was part of the ranch the way the land and the water and the good Kansas sky were part of it. She knew the cattle by temperament and could read weather in the behavior of the horses before the clouds appeared. She kept the accounts with precision that Joel, who was better with land than with figures, was deeply grateful for. She negotiated with the feed merchant in Abilene with a directness that earned her his immediate and permanent respect, and she negotiated with the Neighbors Association with a diplomatic clarity that resolved more than one dispute over water rights that Joel, left to himself, might have handled less smoothly. She was, as he had told her that February evening by the lamp, necessary. She was also, as the years passed and the containment of her early life in Millhaven continued to loosen in the warmth of being somewhere she was fully known, she was also, increasingly, not quiet in the sense Mrs. Caulfield had meant. Not loud, never that, but expansive. Full. She laughed easily now, and she had learned that her dry wit was something Joel delighted in and would never tire of, and she deployed it accordingly. She talked about her mother without grief covering every word, the way grief eventually loosens its grip when you have had enough good days to balance the loss. She had opinions she no longer kept interior because she had a husband who listened with the full quality of his attention whenever she spoke, which was, she had told him once, the most extraordinary thing about him. "You always listen like what I'm saying matters," she said. "It does," he said. "You always say that," she said. "Because it's always true," he said. She had told him on their 3rd anniversary, sitting at the kitchen table after supper with the lamp between them. "I want you to know that I am happy, not content, that's not the same thing. I am genuinely, specifically happy, and I know it, and I want you to know that I know it." He had looked at her across the table and felt something so full it was almost difficult to contain. "I know it too," he said, "about you and about me." "Good," she said. "Then we're agreed." "We're agreed," he said. Their second child was a girl, born in the spring of 1885 when the prairie was greening and the meadowlarks were in full voice, and Thomas William, now almost 2, had developed a powerful interest in everything that moved. They named her Margaret Louise Ellsworth, Margaret for Lydia's mother and Louise for Joel's mother, and from the beginning she was quieter than her brother, not withdrawn, but interior, watchful with the dark-eyed seriousness of newborns that sometimes lifts and sometimes stays. It stayed. Margaret Louise Ellsworth, at 2 years old, was already observing the world with a focus that made Lydia laugh with recognition. She is watching everything, Lydia said. She gets that from somewhere, Joel said. She gets it from me, Lydia said without false modesty, and she'll be fine. Margaret was more than fine. She was, in the fullness of time, remarkable, but that would take years to fully unfold, and the world would have its own opinion about it, and the Ellsworths would have theirs, and they would fight for her the way you fight for children when the world is slow to recognize what is standing right in front of it. But that was later. In 1885, she was a baby in a prairie house, and her mother held her and read to her from the first week, and her father built her a carved wooden horse because Thomas William had demanded an explanation for why he couldn't have a baby instead of a sister, and the horse had resolved the negotiation. In the summer of 1886, Frank and Nora visited again with their 3 children, and the Ellsworth ranch became briefly and beautifully chaotic in the way that only happens when extended family descends on a working property, with full enthusiasm and partial understanding of where things go. Thomas William III became best friends with Frank and Nora's youngest, a boy of 4 named Daniel, and the 2 of them conducted a thorough and largely destructive investigation of every outbuilding on the property. Margaret, 14 months, was ferried around by various adult arms and accepted the attention with the regal composure of someone who considers it appropriate. One evening, while the children were asleep and Frank and Nora and Joel and Lydia sat on the back porch with coffee in the warm summer dark, Frank said he had been drinking the strong coffee and was feeling sentimental. "I want it on the record that I arranged all of this." "Nobody disputes that," Joel said. "I want more credit than I receive," Frank said. "You receive the credit of watching it exist," Nora said. "That should be enough." Lydia leaned back in her chair and looked at the stars above the flat Kansas dark and said, "Write a letter to Mrs. Caulfield. That's the credit you deserve. The letter that started everything." Frank was quiet for a moment, and then he said, more quietly than usual, "Was it hard? Coming here not knowing him, not knowing any of this?" Lydia was quiet for a moment too, the old thoughtful pause. "It was uncertain," she said. "Those are different things. I was never afraid of hard. I was waiting to see if the uncertainty was worth it." "And it was," Frank said. She looked at Joel with the look that he had come to know was the real one, the full one, nothing held back. "It was everything," she said. Frank cleared his throat and looked at the stars. Nora patted his arm. "You're going to cry," Nora said. "I'm not going to cry," Frank said. He cried. Joel and Lydia pretended not to notice, because they were kind people, and because it seemed like the right thing to do. The life they built together continued to grow and deepen in the way that good lives do, not without difficulty, not without the ordinary sorrows that come to any family over years, but with the underlying solidity of 2 people who are genuinely committed to each other, and to the home they are making, and to the particular, irreplaceable truth of knowing and being known. August the dog, who had been old when Joel brought Lydia home, died in the winter of 1884 peacefully, on the porch in the morning, with both of them beside him. Lydia had wept with the honest grief of someone who does not cry easily and means it when she does, and Joel had buried August at the edge of the south field where he had liked to lie in the afternoon sun. They got a new dog the following spring, a young shepherd mix with one blue eye and one brown eye that Thomas William immediately named Captain. And Captain was not August, but was his own considerable thing, and grew to belong to the ranch with the totality that good dogs achieve. Thomas Hayes visited every year when he could manage the trip, and every year he arrived a little older and a little more contented, and every year he held his grandchildren and walked the ranch with Joel, and talked about farming in the unhurried way of 2 men who understand each other's work, and every year when he left, Lydia stood at the edge of the road and watched the stage carry him away with the particular expression of someone who loves a person and is comfortable in the love even from a distance. "He's happy," Joel always said. "He is," Lydia always said. And then, "Come back inside, I have work to do." And they would go back inside the house that he had built and she had made into a home, and the work would continue, and the years would carry them forward in the good direction. And everything that needed to be solved between them was solved with honesty and patience, and the willingness to try again if the first attempt didn't work. The third child came in the spring of 1887, another boy, born quick and loud in the way Thomas William had been born, and they named him Franklin Joseph Ellsworth, Franklin for Frank, because by that point it was simply impossible to deny him the honor, and also because Frank had been emotionally lobbying for it for 4 years. Franklin Joseph was, from his first days, a combination of his parents that surprised and delighted them both. He had Lydia's dark eyes and Joel's broad frame, and the particular expression of someone who is simultaneously thinking something through and ready to act before finishing the thought, which was perhaps the most Ellsworth expression possible. Lydia looked at him the third day after his birth, this boy who was so purely the product of her and Joel and the life they had made together, and she said to Joel, "We are very good at this." "We are," he said. "I mean the whole thing," she said. Not just she gestured at the baby. The whole thing. He knew what she meant. He always knew what she meant, which was one of the best things about being married to her. "Yes," he said, "we are." By 1888, the Ellsworth Ranch was 55 acres of good Kansas land with a solid herd, a kitchen garden that was the envy of the neighboring women, and a house that had expanded by 2 rooms since Lydia's arrival, and was still full in the way that a house full of children and books and working life and genuine love is full, not cluttered, but inhabited, every room carrying the warmth of the people who lived inside it. Joel Ellsworth was 37 years old and in the best years of his physical life, still lean and hard from work, his hair gone a little gray at the temples in the way that settled into men who spent their lives in weather. He was, his neighbors agreed without knowing why they agreed, a man who was right where he was supposed to be. There was no waiting in him anymore, no turning toward something he couldn't see. He was here fully in the life he was living, and it showed. Lydia Ellsworth was 30 years old and had become, in the years since Millhaven, something that Mrs. Caulfield's letter could not have predicted and would have been entirely unable to describe. She was still quiet in the sense that mattered. She was not loud. She was not performative. She was not given to displaying herself for approval. But she was complete. She had the sure, settled quality of a woman who knows herself, who knows her place in the life around her, who is loved without reservation and loves without apology. She had her books and her kitchen garden and her 3 children and her accounts and her horses, especially Belle, who had gotten marginally less opinionated over the years, but only marginally. And she had Joel, who listened with the full quality of his attention whenever she spoke, which she had never stopped finding extraordinary. One evening in October, their favorite month, when the light was doing its particular October thing across the prairie and Thomas William had gone to bed and the 2 younger ones were asleep and the house was quiet for the first time all day, Lydia came and stood beside Joel at the back porch railing, and they both looked out at the prairie in the evening light. "I was thinking about a letter today," she said. "Which letter?" he said. "The first one," she said. "The one Mrs. Caulfield wrote." "The one you didn't finish reading." "I finished reading it eventually," he said, "on the train." "I know," she said, "but you packed your bag first." She turned and looked at him, and the evening light was on her face, and she was 30 years old, and she was beautiful in the way that people are beautiful who are entirely themselves. "That was the part that mattered," she said, "that you didn't wait to decide." "I didn't need more information," he said. "I needed to go." "You were reckless," she said, and her voice was warm. "I was certain," he said. "There's a difference." She leaned against him, her shoulder against his arm, the way she had done on so many evenings on this same porch, and he put his arm around her, and she settled into it with the ease of something that has been in place for long enough that it no longer needs to be considered, just inhabited. The prairie spread away from them in every direction, enormous and golden in the late light, the grass moving in the slow wind, the sky above them going deep blue toward the east and orange toward the west where the sun was putting itself to bed. Captain was lying at the bottom of the porch steps with his two different colored eyes half closed, and somewhere in the house behind them, Franklin Joseph was beginning to make the sounds of a child who had not entirely committed to sleep. And in a few minutes, one of them would go in and settle him, and tomorrow the work would start again with the dawn. But just now there was this. The two of them on the back porch of the house he had built for someone and she had made into a home, looking out at the enormous Kansas evening, together in the specific and unbeatable way of people who have chosen each other truly, and have found that choice to be the best one of their lives. Plain and quiet, Lydia said one more time, not with bitterness, with the mild amusement of someone who has entirely outgrown a label and regards it now as simply inaccurate. The worst description ever written, Joel said. The most useful, she said. It brought you here. He thought about that, about the way the wrong words had led him to exactly the right place, how a dismissive summary of who she was had been so thoroughly off that it had moved him to stand up from a kitchen table in Kansas and get on a train. He thought about all the things that letter had not said, and all the things he had found instead. The patience of her, the wit of her, the strength of her, the warmth of her once you had earned the right to see it. The way she loved the October light and read books by lamplight and argued with the feed merchant, and held their children with the particular careful intensity of a woman who knows what love costs and gives it anyway. Plain and quiet. He had read those words and packed his bags before he finished the page, and he would make the same decision every single time, across every version of his life he could imagine, without hesitation, without question, without looking back. "Thank you," he said, which was not what he had meant to say but was what came out. She looked up at him. "For what?" "For being worth coming to," he said. She was quiet for a moment, the real quiet, the deep one. Then she said, "Thank you for coming." Franklin Joseph had made a decision about sleep and announced it from his room, and Lydia straightened from the railing with the familiar, easy motion of a woman who has done this 1,000 times. And she went inside to settle her son. And Joel stood for another moment on the porch looking out at the prairie as the last light held for one perfect instant above the flat horizon before the dark came up from the east and the stars began to arrive. The Kansas night opened above him, enormous and full of light, the same sky it had always been indifferent to small human stories, too vast to see them clearly. But down here, in the warm-lit house behind him, the small human story was everything. It was all of it. He went inside. The lamp was burning in the kitchen. Lydia's book was open on the table. Through the wall he could hear her voice, low and steady, settling their youngest back into sleep. The same voice he had heard the first time in a general store in Millhaven. The same voice that had said agreeable things and sharp things and true things and loving things in the years since, the voice that was the sound of his home. He sat down at the kitchen table and poured himself a cup of coffee from the pot on the stove and opened her book to the page she had marked, not to read it but to know where she was in it, because that was one of the small intimacies of a life shared closely over years. Lydia came back from the children's room and saw him sitting there, and tilted her head slightly, a question without words. "Just waiting," he said. She sat down across from him and took her book back and found her page. The lamp between them was steady and close. Outside the window the prairie night was enormous and the stars were out over the flat land, more stars than a person from Missouri had grown up expecting, and the house was warm and full and entirely, specifically, exactly what it was meant to be. She read. He watched her read. The night moved slowly in the way of good nights, with no rush to become morning, and the Ellsworth ranch sat quiet under the Kansas stars. And inside the house that had been built for someone and had become a home, everything that had needed to happen had happened, and everything that had needed to find its place had found it. And two people who had come to each other by way of a letter and a train and a bad description and an unfinished page were sitting across a kitchen table in the lamplight. And they were simply fully, without reservation or remainder home.